surfing at dawn, catching the perfect wave. A dorsal fin cut through the swell behind. Heart racing, paddling desperately for the beach. The board suddenly jerked, pulled into the abyss, plunging into darkness, surrounded by sleek black skin. The ocean's apex predator had chosen its meal. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment, telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Mark Chen squinted against the glare of the California sun as he double-checked his diving gear. The salty breeze ruffled his short black hair, carrying with it the pungent scent of kelp and the promise of adventure. At 32, Mark was no stranger to the ocean's depths, having logged hundreds of dives across the world's seas. But there was something special about Monterey Bay that always called him back. "You sure about going solo today, Mark?" called out Jake, the weathered captain of the small diving boat bobbing gently in the waves. "Visibility's not great and the currents are tricky." Mark flashed a confident grin. "Don't worry, Jake, I know these waters like the back of my hand. Besides, I've got a new underwater camera to test out." Jake shook his head, a mixture of admiration and concern etched on his sun-weathered face. "All right, hotshot. Just remember the basics. Check your air, mind your depth, and for God's sake, don't get tangled in the kelp." "Yes, Mom." Mark chuckled, securing his mask. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp ocean air one last time before plunging into the cool, embracing waters of Monterey Bay. The initial shock of cold quickly faded as Mark's wetsuit did its job. He released a stream of bubbles, equalizing the pressure in his ears as he descended. The murky green water gradually cleared, revealing the ethereal beauty of the kelp forest below. Massive fronds of bull kelp swayed hypnotically in the gentle current, their golden brown leaves filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the rocky seafloor. Schools of brightly colored rockfish darted between the kelp's thick stalks, while curious sea otters peered at Mark from a distance. Mark activated his underwater camera, capturing the mesmerizing dance of light and shadow. Through his regulator, he hummed contentedly, feeling perfectly at home in this alien world. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the kelp grew denser, creating shadowy corridors and hidden grottos. Mark's trained eyes scanned for interesting subjects, perhaps a shy octopus or a lounging leopard shark. The muffled sounds of his own breathing and the occasional pop of snapping shrimp were the only noises breaking the underwater silence. Suddenly, a faint, unfamiliar sound caught Mark's attention. It was unlike anything he'd heard before in these waters, a series of clicks and whistles that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. He paused, suspended in the water column, straining to listen. The strange sounds faded as quickly as they had appeared. Mark shook his head, wondering if he'd imagined it. Probably just a pod of dolphins passing by, he thought, trying to reassure himself. But a nagging sense of unease had taken root in the pit of his stomach. Determined to shake off the odd feeling, Mark pressed on, focusing on the beauty surrounding him. He spotted a vibrant nudibranch, its frilly appendages a riot of psychedelic colors against the muted tones of the kelp. Carefully adjusting his buoyancy, he moved in for a close-up shot. Just as he was about to press the shutter, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. A dark shape, massive and sleek, glided through a gap in the kelp some 50 feet away. It was gone in an instant, leaving Mark wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. His heart rate quickened, the sound of his breathing suddenly loud in his ears. "Get a grip, Chen," he scolded himself. "It's probably just a sea lion." But even as he tried to rationalize, Mark knew that what he'd glimpsed was far too large to be a sea lion. The kelp forest, which had seemed so welcoming just moments ago, now felt oppressive. Shadows lurked in every crevice, and the gently waving fronds seemed to reach for him with grasping fingers. Mark's eyes darted left and right, searching for another glimpse of the mysterious shape. A series of rapid clicks cut through the water, much closer this time. Mark spun around, his heart pounding. The sounds were familiar. He'd heard them before in nature documentaries. Echolocation. But not from dolphins. No, this was something much larger. "Orca," Mark whispered through his regulator. the word escaping in a stream of bubbles. His mind raced. Orcas weren't unheard of in Monterey Bay, but encounters with divers were extremely rare. They weren't known to attack humans in the wild, but the thought of being mistaken for a seal sent a chill down Mark's spine. He needed to get out of the water. Now, Mark fumbled for his compass, trying to orient himself back towards the boat. But in his panic, he'd lost track of his position in the twisting kelp forest. Every direction looked the same, an endless maze of undulating brown fronds. The clicking intensified, seeming to come from all around him. Mark's breathing came in short, sharp bursts, using up his precious air supply far too quickly. He forced himself to take slower, deeper breaths, fighting against the rising tide of panic. "Think, damn it," he muttered. What would Jake do? Slowly, an idea formed. If he could get to the surface, he could signal for help. But a rapid ascent risked decompression sickness. He'd have to take it slow, making safety stops along the way. Mark began a controlled ascent, keeping a wary eye on his depth gauge. The kelp thinned slightly as he rose, shafts of sunlight penetrating the gloom. For a moment, hope surged within him. Then he saw it. A sleek, black dorsal fin, tall and straight, cut through a gap in the kelp no more than 30 feet away. It was massive, far larger than Mark had imagined. The orca's black and white body followed, graceful despite its size. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The orca's eye, intelligent and curious, fixed upon him. In that moment, Mark felt like a tiny, insignificant speck in the vastness of the ocean. He was no longer the experienced diver, confident in his skills and knowledge. He was prey, being sized up by one of the ocean's apex predators. The orca circled slowly, its movements deliberate and controlled. Mark remained as still as possible, hoping against hope that the creature would lose interest and move on. But, with each pass, the orca drew closer. Panic clawed at the edges of Mark's mind. He knew he couldn't outswim the orca, not in its own element. His only chance was to make it to denser kelp, to find a hiding spot too small for the massive predator to reach. With a powerful kick, Mark propelled himself towards a thick stand of kelp. The sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the orca. It let out a haunting, high-pitched call that reverberated through the water and Mark's very bones. The chase had begun. As Mark frantically swam for the safety of the kelp forest, the enormity of his situation crashed over him like a wave. He was alone, deep in the ocean, being pursued by one of nature's most efficient hunters. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. This dive, meant to be a routine excursion, might very well be his last. The kelp forest loomed ahead, promising sanctuary. But as the sound of the orca's approach grew louder behind him, Mark couldn't shake the chilling thought that he was no longer the observer in this underwater world. He had become part of the food chain, a potential meal for a creature that ruled these waters long before humans ever dared to venture into them. With desperation fueling his every move, Mark plunged into the thick kelp, the fronds enveloping him like a living shroud. The real horror of his situation was just beginning to unfold, and the kelp forest, once a place of wonder and beauty, had transformed into an arena of primal survival. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed deeper into the kelp forest, the fronds closing in around him like a living curtain. The eerie clicks and whistles of the orca's echolocation seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting him further. He paused for a moment, trying to control his ragged breathing and gather his thoughts. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, through his regulator. "Think, Mark, think." The kelp swayed gently in the current, creating a hypnotic dance of light and shadow. In any other circumstance, Mark would have found it beautiful. Now it only added to his rising sense of panic. Every shadow could be the orca, every movement a potential attack. Suddenly, a massive shape glided past the edge of his vision. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head and his eyes widened in a mixture of awe and terror. The orca was there, barely 20 feet away, its black and white form a stark contrast against the golden-brown kelp. It moved with a grace that belied its enormous size, easily maneuvering through gaps in the kelp that seemed far too small for its bulk. Mark's mind raced, recalling everything he knew about orcas. They were highly intelligent, social creatures, known for their complex hunting strategies. But attacks on humans were extremely rare. Was this one simply curious? Or was Mark about to become a tragic statistic? The orca circled slowly, its dark eye fixed on Mark. He could almost feel the weight of its gaze, assessing him with an intelligence that seemed almost alien. Mark remained as still as possible, hoping that if he didn't present as a threat or prey, the orca might lose interest. Minutes passed, though to Mark they felt like hours. His air gauge showed he still had plenty of oxygen, but he knew he couldn't stay down here indefinitely. Eventually, he'd have to surface, and the thought of trying to ascend with the orca nearby sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly, the orca let out a series of sharp clicks. The sound reverberated through the water, seeming to vibrate in Mark's very bones. To his horror, he heard an answering call from somewhere in the distance. The orca wasn't alone. "Oh God," Mark whispered, a stream of bubbles escaping his regulator. "There's more of them." As if in response to his realization, the orca began to move closer. Its movements were deliberate, almost curious. Mark's mind flashed to documentaries he'd seen of orcas toying with seals, tossing them in the air before finally consuming them. Was that to be his fate? Mark's instincts screamed at him to flee, but he knew that any sudden movement could trigger the orca's predatory response. Instead, he began to slowly, ever so slowly, back away into denser kelp. The orca followed, matching his pace. Its massive dorsal fin, easily 6 feet tall, cut through the water with barely a ripple. Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from its mouth, rows of sharp teeth designed for ripping and tearing flesh. "Nice orca," Mark found himself saying, the words muffled by his regulator. "You don't want to eat me. I'm all bones and neoprene. Probably taste terrible." The absurdity of trying to reason with a wild animal hit him, and a hysterical laugh bubbled up in his throat. He choked it back, knowing he needed to stay focused. The orca suddenly darted forward, coming to a stop barely 10 feet from Mark. He could see every detail of its massive form. The smooth, rubbery skin, the scars that told stories of past battles, the intelligent eye that seemed to bore into his very soul. Mark's hand instinctively went to his dive knife strapped to his leg. But what good would a 6-inch blade do against a creature that could grow up to 32 feet long and weigh up to 6 tons? He left the knife where it was, knowing it would be useless at best, and at worst, might provoke an attack. The standoff continued, man and beast locked in a silent battle of wills. Mark's mind raced, trying to recall everything he knew about orca behavior. They were known to be curious about divers, sometimes approaching to investigate. But this felt different. The orca's behavior was too focused, too intense. Suddenly the orca opened its mouth wide, displaying its impressive array of teeth. Mark's blood ran cold. Was this it? The end? But instead of attacking, the orca let out a haunting, melodic call. The sound was unlike anything Mark had ever heard, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It echoed through the kelp forest, seeming to come from everywhere at once. In that moment, despite his fear, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. He was witnessing something few humans ever had, a close encounter with one of the ocean's most magnificent and feared predators. The moment was shattered as the orca suddenly lunged forward. Mark reacted on pure instinct, kicking hard to propel himself backward. He felt the rush of displaced water as the orca passed by, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it. Panic overtook him, and Mark abandoned all thoughts of staying still. He turned and swam hard, pushing through the kelp with desperate strength. Behind him, he could hear the orca's clicks intensifying, growing louder and more frequent. The chase was on. Mark's muscles burned as he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. The kelp whipped past him, leaves slapping against his mask and tugging at his equipment. He knew he couldn't outswim an orca. In open water, they could reach speeds of up to 34 miles per hour. His only hope was to use the kelp forest to his advantage, to find a space too small for the orca to follow. A quick glance over his shoulder showed the orca effortlessly keeping pace, its massive form slipping through the water with fluid grace. Its echolocation clicks had taken on a different tone, faster, more excited. The sound filled Mark with dread. This was no longer curiosity. This was hunting behavior. Come on, Mark urged himself, scanning frantically for a place to hide. The kelp was thick here, but not thick enough. He needed something more. Ahead, he spotted a rocky outcropping, covered in a dense mat of kelp. It wasn't much, but it was the best option he had. Mark made for it, his legs kicking furiously. Just as he reached the rocks, he felt a rush of water behind him. The orca had made another pass, so close he felt the brush of its slick skin against his flipper. Mark's heart leaped into his throat. He'd nearly been caught. With a final burst of energy, Mark wedged himself into a crevice in the rocks, pulling the kelp around him like a blanket. He pressed himself as far back as he could, feeling the rough stone scrape against his wetsuit. For a moment, all was quiet. Mark hardly dared to breathe, watching the water in front of his hiding spot. Had he lost the orca? Had it given up? The chase? His hopes were dashed as a large, dark shape moved into view. The orca circled the rocky outcropping, its movements slow and deliberate. It was searching for him. Mark's air gauge caught his eye, and his heart sank. In his panic, he'd been breathing too quickly, using up his air supply at an alarming rate. He forced himself to take slower, deeper breaths, but the damage was done. He had maybe 20 minutes of air left. 30, if he really stretched it. The orca continued to circle, occasionally emitting bursts of clicks and whistles. Were they calls to the rest of its pod? Mark shuddered at the thought of multiple orcas joining the hunt. As he watched the predator search for him, a part of Mark's mind marveled at the orca's intelligence and persistence. This was why they were apex predators, why they sat atop the ocean's food chain. Their hunting skills were unparalleled. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The orca showed no signs of giving up, methodically searching every nook and cranny of the rocky outcropping. It was only a matter of time before it found Mark's hiding spot. His options were running out. He could stay hidden and hope the orca lost interest before his air ran out, but that seemed unlikely. He could make a break for the surface, but the orca would almost certainly catch him in open water. Or he could try to find a new hiding spot, but that risked exposing himself. As Mark weighed his limited options, the orca suddenly let out a loud, piercing call. The sound reverberated through the water, making Mark's teeth rattle. And then, to his horror, he heard an answering call in the distance. The pod was coming. Mark knew he had to act now. Staying put was no longer an option. With a deep breath, to steel his nerves, he prepared himself to leave his hiding spot. But which way should he go? Towards the surface meant open water, where the orca would have the advantage. Deeper into the kelp forest offered more cover, but also the risk of getting tangled or lost. As Mark grappled with this life-or-death decision, the orca made another pass by his hiding spot. This time it turned its head, its eye meeting Mark's gaze through the kelp. There was an intelligence there, a focused determination that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. In that moment, as predator and prey locked eyes, Mark knew with chilling certainty that this encounter was far from over. The orca had found him, and it had no intention of letting him go. The true test of survival was about to begin, and Mark would need every ounce of his skill, courage, and luck to make it out alive. With his heart pounding and adrenaline coursing through his veins, Mark prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be the fight of his life. The kelp forest, once a place of wonder and beauty, had become an underwater arena, where the line between life and death was as thin as a strand of kelp. And as the orca moved in, its intention clear, Mark knew that his next move would determine whether he lived to see another day or became just another link in the ocean's unforgiving food chain. Mark's muscles tensed as he prepared to leave his rocky refuge. The orca's eye, dark and intelligent, remained fixed on his hiding spot. There was no point in waiting any longer. He had been found. With a powerful kick, Mark burst from the kelp, shooting upwards towards what he hoped was the direction of the surface. The sudden movement startled a school of rockfish, sending them scattering in a silver flash. Behind him, he heard the orca's powerful tail propel it forward. The chase was on in earnest now. Mark's mind raced as he swam, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Think, damn it," he urged himself. "You can't outswim it. You need a plan." The kelp forest stretched endlessly before him, a maze of golden brown, fronds swaying in the current. Mark zigged and zagged, hoping to use the dense vegetation to his advantage. But the orca matched his every move, its massive form slicing through the water with terrifying ease. Suddenly, a barrage of clicks filled the water. The echolocation was so intense it seemed to vibrate through Mark's very bones. The disorienting sound made it hard to focus, hard to think. It's trying to confuse me, Mark realized. The orca was using its natural sonar, not just to track him, but as a weapon. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The orca was mere feet behind him, its mouth slightly open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Mark's heart nearly stopped at the sight. In his panic, he failed to notice a thick strand of kelp directly in his path, his arm tangled in the sturdy plant, jerking him to an abrupt halt. Mark thrashed wildly, trying to free himself as the orca closed in. "No, no, no!" he cried through his regulator, bubbles streaming from his mouth. His free hand scrambled for his dive knife, fingers fumbling with the clasp. The orca was upon him now, circling slowly. Was it savoring the moment? Toying with its prey? Mark's fingers finally closed around the knife handle. He slashed at the kelp, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. Just as the orca made a lunge, the kelp gave way. Mark kicked hard, propelling himself sideways. He felt the rush of water as the orca passed by, so close that its pectoral fin brushed against his leg. Not pausing to think, Mark plunged deeper into the kelp forest. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The orca's clicks and whistles pursued him, seeming to come from all directions at once. As he swam, a memory flashed through Mark's mind, a nature documentary he'd watched years ago. It had shown orcas hunting seals in Antarctica, creating waves to wash the seals off ice floes. The orcas had worked as a team, displaying problem-solving skills and coordination that had left Mark in awe. Now, that same intelligence was being turned against him. The kelp grew denser as Mark pushed deeper, the fronds so thick they nearly blocked out all light. He squeezed through gaps that seemed barely wide enough for his body, hoping against hope that they would be too small for the orca to follow. But the clicking never ceased. The orca was still there, still hunting. Mark's lungs burned and he realized he'd been holding his breath. He forced himself to breathe normally, knowing that using up his limited air supply too quickly could be just as deadly as the predator pursuing him. A quick check of his gauge showed less than 15 minutes of air left. The situation was becoming more dire by the second. Suddenly the kelp in front of Mark parted, and he found himself face to face with the orca once more. Its eye seemed to bore into him, filled with an almost human-like determination. Mark reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed a thick strand of kelp and swung himself around, using it like a vine to change direction abruptly. The orca, caught off guard by the maneuver, shot past him. For a brief moment, Mark felt a surge of triumph. He had outmaneuvered one of the ocean's top predators. But his victory was short-lived. The orca recovered quickly, wheeling around, with astonishing agility for its size. It let out a haunting call that echoed through the water. To Mark's horror, he heard answering calls in the distance. The rest of the pod was drawing closer. This can't be happening, Mark thought, his mind reeling. He had come to these waters countless times, always feeling at home in the kelp forest. Now, that same forest felt like a closing trap, with dangers lurking behind every swaying frond. He pushed on, his muscles screaming in protest. The kelp seemed to grab at him, slowing his progress. In his panic, Mark failed to notice how the plants were becoming entangled in his gear. A particularly stubborn strand wrapped around his ankle, bringing him to a sudden stop. Mark pulled at it frantically, but it held fast. More kelp entwined around his arms as he struggled. "No, please, no," he pleaded. Though he knew the kelp couldn't hear or care about his desperation, he was trapped, suspended in the water like a fly in a spider's web. The orca's clicks grew louder. It had sensed his distress and was moving in for the kill. Mark could see its massive form circling, drawing ever closer with each pass. In that moment, suspended in the kelp and facing what he was sure would be his doom, a strange calm settled over Mark. Time seemed to slow. He became acutely aware of every detail: the gentle sway of the kelp, the shimmer of light filtering through the fronds, the graceful movements of the orca as it circled. If this is it, Mark thought, at least it's happening in the place I love most. But as the orca made its final approach, something deep within Mark rebelled against the idea of giving up. He was a survivor, a seasoned diver who had faced and overcome challenges before. This was just another challenge, albeit the most serious one he'd ever encountered. With renewed determination, Mark began methodically freeing himself from the kelp. His movements were calm and deliberate now, a stark contrast to his earlier panic. Strand by strand, he untangled his gear, all the while keeping a wary eye on the approaching orca. The predator was almost upon him when Mark finally broke free. With a powerful kick, he propelled himself forward, shooting through a narrow gap in the kelp just as the orca lunged. Mark felt the rush of displaced water as the orca's jaws snapped shut mere inches from his flippers. The close call sent a surge of adrenaline through his body, giving him a much-needed burst of speed. He swam harder than he ever had before, pushing through the burning in his muscles and the growing tightness in his chest as his air supply dwindled. The orca's frustrated calls echoed behind him, spurring him on. As he swam, Mark's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. He couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later he would run out of air or strength. He needed to find a way out, a way to safety. Suddenly the kelp forest began to thin. Ahead, Mark could see open water. For a moment, hope surged within him. If he could reach the surface, maybe he could signal for help. But as he burst out of the kelp, that hope turned to icy dread. He had emerged into a clearing in the forest, an open area about the size of a small swimming pool. And he wasn't alone. 3 more orcas were waiting, their dorsal fins cutting through the water's surface. They had been hurting him, Mark realized with a sinking feeling. The entire chase had been coordinated, driving him exactly where they wanted him. As the orcas began to close in, their movements synchronized with an almost eerie precision, Mark knew he was facing the fight of his life. Trapped between the dense kelp forest behind him and the pod of hunting orcas ahead, his options were rapidly running out. With his air supply critically low and his strength fading, Mark Chen, experienced diver and lover of the ocean, found himself in a situation he had never imagined possible. He was prey, caught in an underwater hunt orchestrated by some of the most intelligent predators on Earth. As the orcas drew ever closer, their intentions clear in their focused movements, Mark steeled himself for what was to come. Whether this would be his last dive or the start of an incredible tale of survival remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, the real battle was only just beginning. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he hovered in the clearing, the 4 orcas circling him with predatory grace. Their black and white forms cut through the water effortlessly, dorsal fins slicing the surface like knives. He was trapped, in a living carousel of teeth and muscle, each revolution bringing the massive predators closer. "Think, Mark, think," he urged himself, eyes darting frantically between the approaching orcas and the tangled kelp forest behind him. His dive computer beeped insistently, warning him of his critically low air supply. He had minutes left at best. The lead orca, the one that had chased him from the start, let out a series of sharp clicks. The others responded, their calls, creating a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. Mark's disorientation grew, his sense of up and down blurring in the chaos. Suddenly, the lead orca lunged forward. Mark barely had time to react, twisting his body to avoid the gaping jaws. He felt the rush of water as the massive creature passed by, close enough that he could have reached out and touched its smooth skin. In that moment of terror, a crazy idea formed in Mark's oxygen-deprived brain. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was the only plan he had. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Mark waited for the orca to circle back around. As it approached again, he kicked hard, propelling himself straight towards the oncoming predator. The orca, clearly not expecting its prey to swim towards, it hesitated for a split second. That moment of hesitation was all Mark needed. At the last possible instant, he dove, streamlining his body to slip beneath the orca's massive form. He felt the creature's belly brush against his back as he passed under it, the contact sending a jolt of primal fear through his body. But he had no time to dwell on it. The moment he cleared the orca, Mark made a beeline for the kelp forest. Behind him, he could hear the frustrated calls of the orcas as they realized their prey was escaping. Mark plunged into the dense kelp, pushing aside the thick fronds with desperate strength. The orca's clicking intensified, the sound seeming to vibrate through the water and into his very bones. They were in pursuit once more. As he swam deeper into the forest, Mark's legs became entangled in the kelp. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he fought to free himself, all too aware of the predators closing in behind him. With fumbling fingers, he unsheathed his dive knife and began hacking at the clinging fronds. Come on, he muttered. Through his regulator, his words lost in a stream of bubbles. Each second felt like an eternity as he worked to free himself, the sound of the approaching orcas growing ever louder. Finally, the last strand gave way. Mark kicked hard, propelling himself deeper into the kelp forest. He weaved through the dense vegetation, taking every twist and turn he could manage. His hope was to lose the orcas in the underwater maze, to find a hiding spot too small for their massive bodies to reach. As he swam, Mark's eyes scanned desperately for any potential shelter. His gaze fell upon a rocky outcropping, its base surrounded by a thick mat of kelp. It wasn't much, but it was the best option he had. With the last of his strength, Mark made for the rocks. He could hear the orcas behind him, their powerful bodies easily parting the kelp that had so hindered his own progress. They were gaining on him quickly. Just as he reached the rocks, Mark felt a rush of water behind him. He turned to see the lead orca lunging forward, its jaws open wide. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Mark could see every detail of the creature's mouth, the rows of sharp teeth, the pink gums, the dark void of its throat. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Mark twisted his body and kicked hard. He felt the orca's teeth graze his flipper as he narrowly avoided its bite. The close call sent a surge of terror through him, spurring him to swim faster than he ever had before. He reached the rocky outcropping and immediately began searching for a crevice, a gap, anything that might offer shelter. His hands scraped against the rough stone as he frantically explored its surface. There, a narrow fissure in the rock face partially hidden by a curtain of kelp. Without hesitation, Mark wedged himself into the crevice, pulling the kelp around him like a living blanket. He pressed himself as far back as he could, feeling the rough stone scrape against his wetsuit. For a moment all was quiet. Mark hardly dared to breathe, watching the water in front of his hiding spot. Had he lost the orcas? Had they given up the chase? His hopes were dashed as a large, dark shape moved into view. The lead orca circled the rocky outcropping, its movements slow and deliberate. It was searching for him. Mark's air gauge caught his eye, and his heart sank. In his panic, he'd been breathing too quickly, using up his air supply at an alarming rate. The gauge was now in the red. He had maybe 5 minutes of air left, 10 if he really stretched it. The orca continued to circle, occasionally emitting bursts of clicks and whistles. Were they calls to the rest of its pod? Mark shuddered at the thought of multiple orcas joining the hunt. As he watched the predator search for him, a part of Mark's mind marveled at the orca's intelligence and persistence. This was why they were apex predators, why they sat atop the ocean's food chain. Their hunting skills were unparalleled. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The orca showed no signs of giving up, methodically searching every nook and cranny of the rocky outcropping. It was only a matter of time before it found Mark's hiding spot. His options were running out. He could stay hidden and hope the orca lost interest before his air ran out. But that seemed unlikely. He could make a break for the surface, but the orca would almost certainly catch him in open water. As Mark weighed his limited options, the orca suddenly let out a loud, piercing call. The sound reverberated through the water, making Mark's teeth rattle. And then, to his horror, he heard answering calls in the distance. The rest of the pod was converging on his location. Mark's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He was trapped, with no clear path to safety and a dwindling air supply. For the first time since the chase began, he allowed himself to consider the very real possibility that he might not make it out of this alive. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, thinking of his wife waiting for him on shore. "I'm so sorry." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a small part of Mark refused to give up. He was a survivor, an experienced diver who had faced and overcome challenges before. This was just another challenge, albeit the most serious one he'd ever encountered. With trembling hands, Mark checked his equipment one last time. His tank was nearly empty, but his regulator was still functioning. His dive computer blinked an angry red, warning him of his dangerously low air supply and the need to ascend. As he took stock of his situation, Mark's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The orcas were intelligent hunters, known for their problem-solving skills and teamwork. He couldn't outswim them, couldn't outfight them. His only hope was to outsmart them somehow. An idea began to form in Mark's oxygen-deprived brain. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was the only plan he had. If he could create a distraction, something to draw the orca's attention away from him, he might have a chance to make a break for the surface. Mark's hand went to his weight belt. Normally, ditching weights was a last resort, used only in dire emergencies. But if there was ever a time for last resorts, this was it. With shaking fingers, Mark unclasped his weight belt. He took one last, deep breath from his nearly empty tank, steeling himself for what was to come. Then, in one swift motion, he flung the weight belt out of his hiding spot. The heavy belt sank quickly, creating a flurry of movement in the water. The lead orca immediately turned towards the disturbance, its echolocation clicks intensifying as it investigated the source of the movement. It was now or never. With his lungs burning and his muscles screaming in protest, Mark burst from his hiding spot. He kicked hard, angling his body towards what he hoped was the direction of the surface. Behind him, he could hear the orca's excited calls as they realized their prey was on the move again. The chase was back on, and this time Mark had no more tricks up his sleeve. It was a straight race to the surface with his life hanging in the balance. As he swam, pushing his body to its absolute limits, Mark's vision began to tunnel. The lack of oxygen was taking its toll, his movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated, but he pushed on, driven by the primal urge to survive. The water around him began to lighten. He was nearing the surface. But would he make it in time? The orca's calls were growing louder, closer. He could almost feel their presence behind him, jaws ready to close around his legs at any moment. With one final desperate surge of energy, Mark reached for the surface. His hand broke through first, followed by his head. He gulped in deep breaths of air, his lungs burning as they filled with precious oxygen. But his ordeal was far from over. As he treaded water, trying to get his bearings, he saw the orca's dorsal fins cutting through the waves around him. They had him surrounded once more, and this time there was nowhere left to hide. Mark Chen, experienced diver and lover of the ocean, found himself in a situation he had never imagined possible. He was prey, caught in an underwater hunt orchestrated by some of the most intelligent predators on Earth. As the orcas closed in, their intentions clear in their focused movements, Mark knew that the real battle for survival was only just beginning. Mark's lungs burned as he gulped in the salty air, his body bobbing in the choppy waves. The taste of the ocean spray on his lips was both a relief and a bitter reminder of his precarious situation. He'd made it to the surface, but he was far from safe. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and barely carrying over the sound of the waves. "Somebody help me!" But there was no response. No boats in sight, no shoreline visible through the misty air, just the vast, uncaring ocean stretching in every direction. And the orcas, their tall dorsal fins cut through the water around him, black triangles of terror circling ever closer. Mark could hear their whistles and clicks, a symphony of predatory intent that chilled him to his core. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, treading water as he tried to keep all the orcas in view. They don't usually attack humans. Maybe they'll lose interest. But even as he said it, Mark knew this situation was far from usual. The orcas had chased him relentlessly through the kelp forest, displaying a focused determination he'd never seen before in his years of diving. Suddenly, a massive black and white form broke the surface barely 10 feet away. The orca's eye, dark and intelligent, seemed to bore into Mark's very soul. For a moment, time stood still as man and beast regarded each other. Then the orca opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a haunting call that echoed across the water. The other orcas responded, their voices joining in a cacophony that vibrated through Mark's body. "Oh God," Mark whispered, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. This was no curious investigation. This was a coordinated hunt, and he was the prey. As if to confirm his fears, one of the orcas suddenly dove, its flukes slapping the water's surface in a spray of white foam. Mark barely had time to take a deep breath before he felt something large brush against his legs. Panic overtook him. He kicked wildly, trying to propel himself away from the unseen threat below. But in every direction, he saw only more dorsal fins, more watchful eyes. He was surrounded. Another orca passed beneath him, so close he could have reached out and touched its smooth skin. Was this how they hunted? Taking turns wearing down their prey until it was too exhausted to fight back? Mark's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. He was a strong swimmer, but he knew he couldn't outpace an orca, let alone an entire pod. His dive gear, usually a source of security, now felt like dead weight dragging him down. In the distance, he heard a faint sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears. But no. There it was again. The low, rhythmic thrum of an engine. Hope surged through Mark's tired body. A boat. Someone was out there. "Hey!" he shouted, waving his arms frantically above his head. "Over here, help!" But his jubilation was short-lived. The orcas, seemingly aware that their window of opportunity was closing, suddenly became more aggressive. They began swimming, in tighter circles around Mark, their dorsal fins cutting the water at alarming speeds. One of the orcas, the large one that had led the chase from the beginning, suddenly surged forward. Mark had just enough time to see its open mouth, a pink cavern lined with gleaming teeth, before it slammed into him from below. The impact knocked the air from Mark's lungs. He was sent tumbling through the water, disoriented and gasping. When he resurfaced, spluttering and coughing, he tasted blood. Whether it was from biting his tongue or something more serious, he couldn't tell. "No, no, no," Mark panted, his voice a ragged whisper. The orcas were closing in again, their movements more purposeful now. He could see their eyes rolling white as they passed, a hunting behavior he'd only ever seen in documentaries. The boat's engine grew louder, but would it arrive in time? Mark didn't know how much longer he could hold out against the orca's relentless assault. Another orca charged, this time from the side. Mark tried to dive beneath it, but he was too slow. He felt a searing pain across his back as the orca's teeth grazed him, tearing through his wetsuit and into flesh. Mark cried out in agony, the sound echoing across the water. The salt stung his wound, a constant reminder of how vulnerable he was in this alien environment. "Please," he sobbed, no longer sure if he was addressing the approaching boat, the circling orcas, or some higher power. "Please, I don't want to die like this." The orcas were preparing for another pass. Mark could see them lining up, their bodies sleek torpedoes of muscle and intent. He braced himself, knowing that this might be the final attack. Just then, a spotlight cut through the misty air, illuminating the scene in harsh white light. The beam swept across the water, catching the orcas' black and white bodies in its glare. "There!" a voice shouted from somewhere beyond the light. "I see him!" The cavalry had arrived, but the orcas weren't giving up their prey so easily. If anything, the arrival of the boat seemed to make them more determined. They began vocalizing loudly, their calls taking on a frenzied quality that sent shivers down Mark's spine. The largest orca, the one that had led the hunt from the start, suddenly dove deep. Mark's heart raced as he waited for it to resurface, knowing that an attack from below would be nearly impossible to avoid. "Hang on," the voice from the boat called out. "We're coming for you." But Mark knew they might not reach him in time. He could feel the water displacement as the orca rocketed. Up from the depths, a living missile locked onto its target. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw the orca's massive form breaking the surface, its jaws open wide. He saw the boat, still too far away to help. He saw the other orcas, circling and waiting for their moment. In that instant, suspended between life and death, a strange calm washed over Mark. He thought of Sarah, his wife, waiting for him on shore. He thought of all the dives he'd made, all the wonders he'd seen beneath the waves. If this was to be his last moment, at least it would be in the ocean he loved so much. But some stubborn part of him refused to give up, with the last of his strength. Mark kicked hard, propelling himself to the side just as the orca breached the surface. He felt the rush of displaced water, felt the orca's body brush against his leg as it passed. For a moment he thought he'd made it. Then pain exploded across his calf. The orca's teeth had found their mark, sinking into flesh and muscle. Mark screamed, a primal sound of agony and terror that cut through the night air. The orca began to pull him under, dragging him down into the cold, dark depths. Mark fought with every ounce of strength he had left, kicking and thrashing against the inexorable pull. Just when he thought all was lost, he felt hands grabbing his arms, hauling him upwards. The spotlight blinded him as he broke the surface, coughing and gasping. "We've got you," a voice shouted in his ear. "You're safe now." But even as the rescuers pulled him towards the boat, Mark could hear the orcas calling to each other. They weren't giving up. Not yet. As he was hauled over the side of the boat, his injured leg leaving a trail of blood on the deck, Mark caught one last glimpse of the orcas. They were circling the boat, their dorsal fins cutting through the waves like dark knives. The largest, orca, the one that had nearly claimed him, rose partially out of the water. Its eye, dark and inscrutable, met Mark's gaze one final time. In that moment, Mark saw something he couldn't quite explain. Not just hunger or predatory instinct, but an intelligence that seemed almost disappointed. Then the orca sank beneath the waves, and the pod began to disperse. Their haunting calls echoed across the water as they disappeared into the misty night, a chilling reminder of how close Mark had come, to becoming just another link in the ocean's food chain. As the boat sped towards shore, Mark lay on the deck, shivering and in shock. The paramedics worked on his injured leg, their voices a blur of medical jargon. But Mark barely heard them. His mind was still out there in the water, reliving every terrifying moment of the encounter. He had survived against all odds. But as the adrenaline began to fade and the full impact of what had happened settled in, Mark knew that this night would haunt him for a long time to come. The ocean, once a source of wonder and joy, now held a darker, more primal aspect in his mind. As the lights of the shore came into view, Mark closed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure. He was alive, but the ordeal was far from over. The true test would be in the days and weeks to come, as he grappled with the physical and psychological aftermath of his brush with nature's most fearsome predators. The orca's final gaze lingered in his mind as consciousness began to slip away. In that intelligent eye, Mark had seen a glimpse of something beyond his understanding, a reminder that in the vast, mysterious ocean, humans were not always at the top of the food chain. The Coast Guard cutter sliced through the choppy waves, its powerful engines thrumming with urgency. Lieutenant Sarah Reeves stood at the helm, her eyes scanning the misty horizon. The distress call had come in 20 minutes ago. A diver in trouble, possibly under attack by marine life. It wasn't the usual rescue operation, and Sarah could feel the tension radiating from her crew. "Any visual contact, Rodriguez?" She called out to her lookout. Petty Officer Rodriguez lowered his binoculars, shaking his head. "Nothing yet, ma'am. This fog isn't helping." Sarah grimaced. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with a thick blanket of fog rolling in from the Pacific. It made their already difficult task even more challenging. "Keep looking," she ordered, "and someone get me an update on that last known position." As if in answer to her command, the radio crackled to life. "Coast Guard cutter, this is Monterey. Bay Aquarium research vessel. We've picked up distress signals approximately 2 nautical miles northwest of your position. Be advised, we're detecting multiple large marine life signatures in the area." Sarah's heart rate quickened. "Roger, that research vessel. We're en route. Any visual on the diver?" There was a pause before the response came. "Negative, Coast Guard, but there's something else you should know. The marine life signatures. They're consistent with a pod of orcas." A hush fell over the bridge. Orcas were not unheard of in these waters, but an attack on a human, that was rare, almost unheard of. "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "We're proceeding with caution. Stand by for further communications." She turned to her crew, seeing the mix of determination and apprehension on their faces. "All right, people, this is what we train for. Rodriguez, keep those eyes peeled. Dawson, ready the rescue gear. Chen, prep the medkit. We don't know what condition this diver will be in when we find them. As her team sprang into action, Sarah's mind raced through scenarios. In all her years with the Coast Guard, she'd never encountered a situation quite like this. Orcas were intelligent, powerful predators. If they had indeed targeted a diver, the chances of survival were... She shook her head, pushing the grim thoughts aside. There would be time for speculation later. Right now, someone needed their help. Contact! Rodriguez's shout cut through the tense silence. 2 o'clock, about 500 yards out. Sarah grabbed her binoculars, following Rodriguez's direction. At first, all she could see was the swirling mist and choppy waves. Then a dark shape broke the surface, a tall, curved dorsal fin. My God, she breathed. It really is orcas. As they watched, more fins appeared, cutting through the water with fluid grace. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct animals, circling something in their midst. Where's the diver? Dawson asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. As if in answer, a human form suddenly burst from the water in the center of the circling orcas. An agonized scream carried across the waves, chilling Sarah to her core. There, she shouted, already moving into action. Full speed ahead, Dawson. Ready the rescue swimmer. Chen, stand by with medical, this is not a drill, people. The cutter surged forward, closing the distance rapidly. Sarah could now make out more details of the horrifying scene. The diver was clearly in distress, struggling to stay afloat amidst the circling predators. As they watched, one of the orcas made a lunge, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from the diver's legs. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered, how is he still alive? Sarah didn't answer. Her focus was entirely on the rescue operation now. They were almost within range, but the orcas showed no signs of backing down. If anything, their behavior seemed to grow more aggressive as the boat approached. Dawson, are you ready? Sarah called out. Petty Officer Dawson appeared at her side, already suited up in rescue gear. Ready, ma'am. But how do we deal with the orcas? It was a valid question, and one Sarah had been wrestling with since they first spotted the pod. Orcas were protected species, and using force against them was out of the question. But they couldn't just sit by and watch a man be torn apart. We'll use the boat to create a barrier, she decided. I'll bring us in close, try to separate the diver from the orcas. You'll have to be quick, Dawson. Get in, secure the victim, and get out. We won't have much time. Dawson nodded, his jaw set with determination. Understood, ma'am. I'm ready, when you are. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. All right, here we go. Everyone hold on. She gunned the engines, sending the cutter surging towards the circling orcas. The massive animals seemed to sense their approach, their movements becoming more frenzied. The divers' cries grew more desperate as the orcas closed in. Hold on, Sarah shouted, both to her crew and to the struggling diver. We're coming. As they drew closer, Sarah could see the terror in the diver's eyes. He was barely keeping his head above water, his movements sluggish from exhaustion and likely injury. Blood tinged the water around him, a stark reminder of the danger he was in. The largest orca, a male with a towering dorsal fin, suddenly dove deep. Sarah's heart raced, knowing what was coming. Dawson, get ready. Chen, spotlight on the water. The powerful beam cut through the mist, illuminating the chaotic scene. Sarah could see the water displacement as the orca rocketed up from the depths, a living torpedo aimed at the helpless diver. Time seemed to slow. Sarah saw the orca's massive form breaking the surface, its jaws open wide. She saw the diver's eyes widen in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. She saw her own hands on the wheel, knuckles white with tension. With a silent prayer, Sarah wrenched the wheel hard to port. The cutter swung around, its hull slamming into the water between the diver and the lunging orca. The impact sent shudders through the boat, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. For a moment, everything was chaos. Water sprayed across the deck, alarms blared, and the orca's calls filled the air with an otherworldly chorus. Then, through the madness, Sarah heard Dawson's voice. I've got him! Pull us up! Sarah's heart leapt. Chen, Monroe, help Dawson. Rodriguez, keep an eye on those orcas. As her crew worked to haul the diver and Dawson aboard, Sarah kept the boat moving, trying to put distance between them and the agitated orcas. The pod wasn't giving up easily, their massive forms shadowing the cutter's movements. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Chen called out, "They're aboard, ma'am." Sarah didn't waste a second. "Hold on, everyone," she shouted, pushing the engines to their limit. The cutter leapt forward, leaving the frustrated orcas in their wake. As they sped toward shore, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had saved the diver from what seemed like certain death. But their job wasn't over yet. She made her way to the stern, where Chen was working on the rescued diver. The man was in bad shape, his wetsuit torn and bloody, his face pale with shock and pain. "How is he?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside them. Chen looked up, his expression grim. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries. He's lost a lot of blood. We need to get him to a hospital fast." The diver's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Sarah with difficulty. The orcas," he mumbled. They hunted me, like I was prey." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now. We're taking you to get help. Can you tell me your name?" "Mark," he whispered. "Mark Chen. I didn't think I'd make it." "Well, you did, Mark," Sarah assured him. "You're one hell of a survivor." As they raced towards the shore, the full weight of what had just transpired began to settle over Sarah. She had seen many things in her years with the Coast Guard, but this was something else entirely. The orca's behavior had been highly unusual. Orcas were known to be curious about divers, sometimes even playful. But a coordinated hunt? That was unheard of. Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the lead orca's eye as it had lunged at Mark. There had been an intelligence there, a focused determination that sent chills down her spine. As the lights of Monterey Bay came into view, Sarah's mind was already racing with the implications of this incident. There would be reports to file, investigations to conduct. The scientific community would undoubtedly have a field day with this. It could potentially reshape our understanding of orca behavior. But those were concerns for later. Right now, her priority was getting Mark the medical attention he desperately needed. As they approached the dock, she could already see the flashing lights of waiting ambulances. "Hang in there, Mark," she said, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're almost there." Mark's eyes found hers, filled with a mixture of pain, gratitude, and lingering fear. "Thank you," he whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Sarah smiled softly. "No need for that. It's what we do. But if you really want to thank us, focus on getting better. And maybe think twice before your next solo dive, yeah?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Mark's face, quickly, replaced by a grimace of pain. As the paramedics swarmed aboard to take over Mark's care, Sarah stepped back, watching as they efficiently transferred him to a stretcher. As Mark was carried off the boat, Sarah caught one last glimpse of his face. The terror was still there, etched in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. She knew that while they had saved his life, Mark's ordeal was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars, those might take much longer to fade. Sarah turned her gaze back out to sea, where the fog was beginning to lift. Somewhere out there, a pod of orcas was swimming, carrying on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they knew about these magnificent creatures. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Sarah knew that this night would mark a turning point. For Mark, for herself, for the scientific community, and perhaps for our entire understanding of the complex, often mysterious relationship between humans and the ocean's apex predators. The rescue was over, but in many ways, Sarah realized, the real work was just beginning. As she prepared to face the barrage of questions and paperwork that awaited her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated incident. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of the raw power and unpredictability of nature. And as the sun rose over Monterey Bay, painting the water in shades of gold and pink, Sarah made a silent promise. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Because if there was one thing this night had taught her, it was that the line between predator and prey was far more blurred than anyone had ever realized. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Mark Chen drifted in and out of consciousness. His body, battered and torn from the ORCA attack, was a canvas of bruises and stitches. The doctors had worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but the true extent of his injuries, both physical and psychological, was yet to be fully understood. Sarah Reeves stood at the foot of Mark's bed, her Coast Guard uniform crisp despite the long, grueling night. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, each breath a small victory against the odds that had been stacked against him. "Lieutenant Reeves?" A soft voice broke through her reverie. Dr. Amelia Foster, the lead physician on Mark's case, entered the room with a tablet in hand. "I have the latest update on Mr. Chen's condition." Sarah nodded, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. "How is he, doctor?" Dr. Foster's expression was a mixture of concern and cautious optimism. "He's stable, which is frankly miraculous given what he's been through. Multiple lacerations, some deep tissue damage, particularly to his left calf where the ORCA got a solid grip. There's also evidence of near drowning and hypothermia, but we're managing those." Sarah absorbed the information, her jaw clenching slightly. "And his prognosis?" "Physically, with time and therapy, he should recover," Dr. Foster replied. "Psychologically, that's another matter entirely. Trauma like this leaves scars that aren't visible to the naked eye." As if on cue, Mark stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, panic flashed across his face as he took in his unfamiliar surroundings. Then his gaze settled on Sarah, and a flicker of recognition brought him back to the present. "The orcas," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are they gone?" Sarah moved to his bedside, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "They're gone, Mark. You're safe now. You're in the hospital." Mark's eyes darted around the room as if expecting to see dorsal fins cutting through the sterile hospital air. "I can still hear them," he murmured. "Their calls, their clicks. It's like they're inside my head." Dr. Foster stepped forward, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. Chen, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal to have vivid memories and sensations. We have a team of psychologists who can help you process what happened." But Mark didn't seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on Sarah, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. "You don't understand," he insisted, his voice growing stronger. "This wasn't just an attack. It was coordinated, planned. They herded me, boxed me in. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Foster. The physician's expression clearly said, "trauma response," but Sarah wasn't so sure. She had seen the orca's behavior firsthand, and it had been far from typical. "Mark," Sarah said gently, "why don't you tell me exactly what happened out there? Start from the beginning." And so, with halting words that grew stronger as he spoke, Mark recounted his harrowing experience. He told of his routine dive in the kelp forest, of the first chilling moment he realized he wasn't alone. He described the initial curiosity, of the orcas turning to focused pursuit, the terrifying chase through the underwater maze of kelp, and the final desperate struggle at the surface. As he spoke, Sarah found herself drawn into the narrative, her training and skepticism warring with the undeniable intensity of Mark's account. This was more than just a random animal encounter. The level of coordination, the persistence, the problem-solving displayed by the orcas. It all pointed to something beyond their current understanding of cetacean behavior. "They were toying with me," Mark concluded, his voice hoarse from the extended recounting. "Like a cat with a mouse. But there was something else in their eyes, especially the big male. It was like they were testing me, studying me." A heavy silence fell over the room as Mark's words hung in the air. Dr. Foster was the first to break it, her tone gentle but tinged with concern. "Mr. Chen, what you've been through is incredibly traumatic. Our minds often try to make sense of chaotic events by attributing patterns or intentions that may not actually." "No," Mark interrupted, a sudden fire in his eyes. "I know what I experienced. This wasn't just animal instinct, there was intelligence behind it, a purpose." Sarah found herself nodding almost unconsciously. "I saw it too," she admitted, drawing surprised looks from both Mark and Dr. Foster. When we were rescuing you, the orca's behavior was unlike anything I've encountered in my years with the Coast Guard. The way they coordinated, the way they responded to our presence, it was unsettling. Dr. Foster looked between the two of them, her professional demeanor slightly shaken. Are you suggesting that these orcas deliberately targeted Mr. Chen? That's unprecedented. I know how it sounds, Sarah acknowledged. But I think we need to consider all possibilities here. This incident could have major implications for our understanding of orca behavior and human cetacean interactions. As if to punctuate her words, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices and hurried footsteps approached the room. Moments later, the door burst open, revealing a harried-looking nurse and two men in suits. "I'm sorry, Dr. Foster," the nurse apologized. They insisted on seeing the patient immediately. The taller of the two men stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Agent Thomas Blackwood, NOAA Law Enforcement. This is my colleague, Dr. Ethan Corey from the Marine Mammal Center. We need to speak with Mr. Chen about the incident." Sarah straightened, her Coast Guard training kicking in. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Reeves, Coast Guard. I was involved in Mr. Chen's rescue. May I ask what this is about?" Agent Blackwood's expression was grim. "There's been another incident. A kayaker was attacked by orcas just off the coast, less than an hour ago. We have reason to believe it may be connected to Mr. Chen's encounter." The room fell silent as the weight of this new information settled over everyone. Mark's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the bedsheets tightly. "It's the same pod," he whispered. "It has to be. They're still out there, still hunting." Dr. Corey, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and intense eyes, stepped closer to Mark's bed. "Mr. Chen, I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, but we need your help. Anything you can tell us about the orca's behavior, any distinguishing features, could be crucial in preventing further incidents." Mark nodded, a newfound determination replacing the fear in his eyes. "I'll tell you everything I can remember. But you have to promise me something." "What's that?" Agent Blackwood asked. "When you go after them, I'm coming with you." The room erupted in a chorus of protests. Dr. Foster was the loudest, her professional calm giving way to genuine concern. "Absolutely not. Mr. Chen, you're in no condition to—" But Mark cut her off, his voice stronger than it had been since he'd been brought in. "You don't understand. I've seen how they think, how they operate. You're going to need me out there." Sarah found herself torn. Every logical part of her mind screamed that allowing a traumatized victim back into a potentially dangerous situation was a terrible idea. But there was something in Mark's eyes, a fire of determination and understanding, that gave her pause. "He's right," she heard herself saying, much to her own surprise. Mark's first-hand experience could be invaluable, and if these orcas are displaying unprecedented behavior, we need every advantage we can get. Agent Blackwood looked skeptical, but Dr. Corey was nodding slowly. From a scientific perspective, Mr. Chen's insights could be crucial. If he's medically cleared and understands the risks— Dr. Foster threw up her hands in exasperation. "This is insane. He nearly died less than 24 hours ago." But Mark was already attempting to sit up, wincing as his injuries protested the movement. "I'll sign whatever waivers you need. But I'm not sitting this out. Not when more people could get hurt." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Despite Dr. Foster's continued objections, Mark was given a provisional medical clearance, with strict conditions on his involvement. Sarah found herself caught up in a flurry of preparations, coordinating with NOAA, the Marine Mammal Center, and her own Coast Guard superiors. As dawn broke over Monterey Bay, a small fleet of vessels headed out to sea. Sarah stood at the helm of the lead boat, her eyes scanning the horizon. Beside her, Mark sat wrapped in thermal blankets, his face a mask of determination, despite the pain she knew he must be in. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him quietly. Mark's gaze remained fixed on the water. "No," he admitted, "but I know I have to do it, for my own peace of mind if nothing else." Sarah nodded, understanding all too well the need for closure after a traumatic event. "We'll find them," she assured him, "and we'll figure out what's going on." As if in answer to her words, A call came from the lookout. "Contact, 3 o'clock, about 800 yards out." Sarah's heart raced as she raised her binoculars. There, cutting through the waves with unmistakable grace, were the tall dorsal fins of a pod of orcas. "It's them," Mark whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "The big male in the lead. That's the one that nearly got me." Sarah relayed the information to the other boats. "Remember," she called out, "our priority is observation and deterrence, no unnecessary risks." As they drew closer to the pod, Sarah could feel the tension radiating from everyone on board. The orcas showed no sign of fleeing, their behavior eerily reminiscent of the night before. Suddenly, the lead orca, the big male Mark had identified, broke away from the pod. It swam directly towards their boat, its movements deliberate and focused. "What's it doing?" Agent Blackwood asked, his hand instinctively moving towards his sidearm. "Wait," Mark said, his voice tight with concentration. It's trying to communicate." As they watched in astonishment, the orca began a series of complex vocalizations. Whistles, clicks, and pulsed calls filled the air, creating a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate through the very hull of the boat. Dr. Curry was frantically operating a hydrophone, his eyes wide with excitement. "This is unprecedented," he muttered. "The complexity of these vocalizations. It's like nothing we've ever recorded." Mark had gone very still, his gaze locked with the orcas. There was something happening here, something beyond scientific explanation or rational understanding. It was as if, for a moment, a bridge had formed between two vastly different species, each reaching out across an impossible divide. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The orca gave one final call, a long, mournful sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Then, with a flick of its massive tail, it turned and rejoined its pod. As they watched, the orcas began to move away, their dorsal fins slowly disappearing beneath the waves. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind a wake of churning water and unanswered questions. A heavy silence fell over the boat. Sarah looked at Mark, seeing the mix of emotions playing across his face: relief, wonder, and a touch of something that might have been understanding. "What just happened?" Agent Blackwood demanded, breaking the spell. Mark shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the orcas had vanished. "I'm not sure," he said softly. "But I think they were saying goodbye. And maybe apologizing." Dr. Curry was beside himself with excitement. This could revolutionize our understanding of cetacean intelligence and interspecies communication. "We need to analyze these recordings, compare them to known orca vocalizations." But Sarah was only half listening. Her attention was on Mark, watching as the tension slowly drained from his body. For the first time since she'd pulled him from the water, he looked at peace. "It's over," Mark said, more to himself than anyone else. "They're moving on." As they turned the boat back toward shore, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There would be reports to file, data to analyze, theories to test. The scientific community would debate the implications of this encounter for years to come. But for now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the coastline of Monterey Bay came into view, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. They had faced something extraordinary, something that challenged their understanding of the natural world and humanity's place in it. And as she watched Mark Chen, a man who had stared death in the face and come out the other side with a newfound connection to the ocean's most formidable predators, Sarah realized that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the true lesson here was one of respect for the ocean, for its inhabitants, and for the delicate balance that existed between all living things. The orcas had disappeared into the vast expanse of the Pacific, carrying with them the secrets of their behavior. But they had left behind a story that would be told and retold, a reminder of the wonders and terrors that lurked beneath the waves, and of the indomitable spirit of those who dared to explore them. As Monterey Bay embraced them once more, Sarah knew that none of them, not her, not Mark, not the scientists or the agents, would ever look at the ocean quite the same way again. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly as it should be. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as Mark Chen stood on the beach, his toes sinking into the cool sand. It had been 3 months since the ORCA attack. 3 months of physical therapy, psychological counseling, and endless debriefings with various government agencies. Now, as he gazed out at the rolling waves of Monterey Bay, Mark found himself grappling with a complex mix of emotions. The physical scars were healing well. The deep gashes on his leg from the orca's teeth were now raised, pink lines. A permanent reminder of his brush with death, but it was the unseen scars, the ones that lurked in the recesses of his mind, that troubled him most. "Penny, for your thoughts?" A familiar voice called from behind him. Mark turned to see Sarah Reeves approaching, her Coast Guard uniform, replaced by casual jeans and a windbreaker. She had become a constant presence in his life since the rescue, an anchor of support during his turbulent recovery. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Mark replied, his eyes drifting back to the ocean. 3 months ago, I couldn't even look at the water without having a panic attack now. Sarah stood beside him, following his gaze out to sea. "And now?" she prompted gently. Mark took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air. "Now I feel drawn to it, like there's something out there calling to me. Is that crazy?" Sarah shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "After what we experienced, I don't think anything qualifies as crazy anymore." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight danced across the water's surface. In the distance, a pod of dolphins leapt and played, their joyful antics a stark contrast to the deadly grace of the orcas that still haunted Mark's dreams. "Have you thought any more about Dr. Corey's offer?" Sarah asked. Breaking the silence, Mark nodded slowly. The marine biologist had been relentless in his pursuit of answers since the incident, analyzing every scrap of data they had gathered during the final confrontation with the orcas. His latest theory, that the orcas had been displaying a previously unknown form of interspecies communication, had the scientific community in an uproar. "He wants me to join his research team," Mark said, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Says my unique perspective could be invaluable." Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. "And what do you think?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "I don't know. Part of me wants to put this all behind me, to go back to my life before, but another part can't let it go." Sarah finished for him. "Exactly." Mark sighed heavily. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The way they moved, the intelligence in their eyes. It was like they were trying to tell us something." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But Mark, you can't let this consume you. You survived, for a reason. Don't forget to live." Her words hit home, and Mark felt a surge of gratitude for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I would have done without you these past few months." She smiled, giving his arm a gentle squeeze before letting go. "That's what friends are for. Now come on. You promised me dinner, and I'm starving." As they turned to leave the beach, Mark cast one last look at the ocean. The dolphins were gone, leaving only the endless expanse of water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, he knew, the orcas were swimming, living their lives unaware of the impact they had had on his. Or were they? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a mixture of fear and excitement that he was only just beginning to understand. The next morning found Mark sitting in Dr. Ethan Curry's cluttered office at the Marine Mammal Center. The walls were covered in charts, graphs, and photographs of various cetaceans. A large whiteboard dominated one wall, covered in scribbled notes and diagrams that Mark could barely make sense of. Dr. Curry himself was a bundle of nervous energy, pacing back and forth as he spoke, his hands gesticulating wildly. "You see, Mark, what we experienced out there was unprecedented. The vocalizations, the coordinated behavior, the apparent attempt at communication. It challenges everything we thought we knew about orca intelligence." Mark nodded, trying to follow the scientist's rapid-fire explanation. "But what does it mean? Why did they attack in the first place?" Dr. Curry stopped pacing, fixing Mark with an intense stare. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've been analyzing the data nonstop for months, and we're still no closer to understanding their motivations. He moved to the whiteboard, grabbing a marker. "But here's what we do know," he said, beginning to sketch out a diagram. The pod's behavior was highly unusual. Orcas are known for their intelligence and complex social structures, but this level of coordinated action against humans is unheard of. Mark leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "So what's your theory?" Dr. Corey's eyes lit up with excitement.
"I believe we witnessed the emergence of a new form of orca culture. One that views humans not just as potential prey, but as competitors? Equals? It's hard to say for certain." He drew a series of interconnected circles on the board. Orca.
Pods have distinct cultures passed down through generations. They have different hunting techniques, vocalizations, even diets. What if this pod has developed a new cultural trait, one that involves direct interaction with humans? Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he considered the implications. But why? What could have triggered this? Dr. Corey shrugged, capping the marker. "That's where you come in, Mark. Your experience, your connection with these animals, it's unique. With your help, we might be able to unravel this mystery." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. The offer was tempting, a chance to find answers to the questions that had plagued him since that terrifying night. But could he face his fears, to willingly put himself in proximity to the creatures that had nearly killed him? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Corey softened his tone. "I know it's a lot to ask, Mark, what you went through. I can't even imagine. But think of the potential benefits. If we can understand why this happened, we might be able to prevent future attacks. We could revolutionize our understanding of cetacean intelligence." Mark stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the bay. In the distance, he could see boats heading out for a day of whale watching. How many of those tourists knew the true nature of the predators that lurked beneath the waves? "What exactly would you need me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Corey joined him at the window, his excitement palpable. "We're planning an extended research expedition. 3 months at sea, tracking and observing orca pods along the coast. Your role would be part observer, part test subject. We want to see if the orcas respond differently to you given your history." Mark's heart raced at the thought of being back on the water, in close proximity to orcas. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a burning curiosity, a need to understand. "I'll do it," he heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as they did Dr. Corey. The scientist's face broke into a wide grin. "Excellent. You won't regret this, Mark. We're on the cusp of something groundbreaking, I can feel it." As they shook hands, sealing the agreement, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping onto a path that would change his life forever. For better or worse remained to be seen. The weeks leading up to the expedition passed in a blur of preparations. Mark threw himself into studying orca behavior, determined to be as prepared as possible for whatever they might encounter. He spent hours poring over research papers, watching documentaries, and discussing theories with Dr. Corey and his team. But as the departure date loomed closer, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. Each night, Mark found himself back in the kelp forest, pursued by shadowy figures with gleaming teeth and intelligent eyes. He would wake up gasping for air, his sheets soaked with sweat. It was after one such nightmare, a week before they were set to leave, that Mark found himself driving to Sarah's apartment in the middle of the night. She answered the door in pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes immediately sharpened, with concern when she saw his haggard face. "Mark, what's wrong?" He stepped inside, collapsing onto her couch. "I don't know if I can do this, Sarah. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I can feel their teeth, hear their calls. What if I freeze up out there? What if I put the whole team in danger?" Sarah sat beside him, her presence a calming influence. "Mark, look at me," she said firmly, waiting until he met her gaze. "You are one of the strongest people I know. You survived something that would have broken most people, and you're willingly facing it again. That takes incredible courage." Mark shook his head, unconvinced. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like insanity. Maybe it's a bit of both," Sarah said with a small smile. "But you're not alone in this. You have a whole team supporting you, and you have me. I've pulled some strings with the Coast Guard. I'll be joining the expedition as a safety officer." Mark's eyes widened in surprise. "You will? But Sarah, you don't have to. She cut him off with a wave of her hand. I want to. Besides, someone needs to keep you out of trouble. For the first time in days, Mark felt the tight knot of anxiety, in his chest loosened slightly. Knowing that Sarah would be there, a steady presence amid the uncertainty, gave him a renewed sense of determination. Thank you, he said softly, the words inadequate to express his gratitude. Sarah squeezed his hand. That's what friends are for. Now why don't you try to get some sleep? We've got a big adventure ahead of us. As Mark settled onto Sarah's couch, a blanket draped over him, he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't have to face them alone. The day of departure dawned bright and clear, the waters of Monterey Bay calm and inviting. The research vessel, a converted fishing trawler named the Cetacean Song, was abuzz with activity as the team made final preparations. Mark stood on the dock, his duffel bag at his feet, taking in the organized chaos. Dr. Curry was directing the loading of scientific equipment, his excited voice carrying over the general din. A team of graduate students scurried about, checking and double-checking supplies. Ready for this? Sarah's voice came from behind him. She was dressed in her Coast Guard uniform, looking every inch the professional. Mark took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. As ready as I'll ever be, he replied, surprised to find that he meant it. As they boarded the ship, Mark felt a strange sense of homecoming. Despite everything that had happened, the ocean still called to him, its vast mysteries beckoning. Dr. Curry gathered the team on deck once everything was loaded. His eyes were bright with excitement as he addressed the group. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to embark on a journey that could change our understanding of cetacean intelligence forever. The orcas we're studying have displayed behavior that defies explanation. Our job is to observe, document, and try to understand. He turned to Mark, his expression softening slightly. And to our star participant, Mr. Chen, thank you for your bravery. Your insights will be invaluable. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. As the engines rumbled to life and the shoreline began to recede, he gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white. Part of him wanted to jump overboard, to swim back to the safety of land. But a stronger part, the part that had survived the attack and come out stronger, urged him forward. The first few days at sea passed uneventfully. The team fell into a routine of data collection, analysis, and theoretical discussions. Mark found himself warming to the work, his natural curiosity overriding his lingering fears. He spent hours on deck with high-powered binoculars, scanning the waves for any sign of dorsal fins. It was on the 5th day that they had their first encounter. Mark was at his usual post on deck when he spotted them, a pod of orcas, their distinctive black and white forms cutting through the waves about half a mile from the ship. "Contact!" he called out, his voice steady despite the sudden racing of his heart. "Orcas off the port bow!" The deck erupted into a flurry of activity. Dr. Curry rushed to Mark's side, practically bouncing with excitement. "Excellent spot, Mark. How many can you see?" Mark counted quickly. "At least 6, maybe more. There's a large male." He trailed off, his breath catching in his throat. The male's dorsal fin was unmistakable, tall and straight, with a distinctive notch near the top. "It's them," he whispered. "It's the same pod." Dr. Curry's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Mark nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the orcas. "Positive. I'd recognize that male anywhere." The scientist was already shouting orders, directing the team to deploy hydrophones and prepare the small research boats. But Mark barely heard him. His world had narrowed to the sleek forms in the water, memories of terror and awe washing over him in equal measure. A hand on his shoulder startled him out of his trance. It was Sarah, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "You okay?" she asked softly. Mark took a shaky breath. "Yeah, I think so. It's just seeing them again." Sarah squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "You don't have to do this, Mark. No one would blame you if you sat this one out." But Mark was already shaking his head. "No, I need to do this. I need to understand." As the small research boats were lowered into the water, Mark felt a strange calm settle over him. This was it, the moment of truth. Would the orcas recognize him? Would they try to communicate again? Or would they attack, finishing what they had started months ago? Mark climbed into one of the boats with Dr. Corey, Sarah, and 2 graduate students. As they moved away from the larger ship, drawing closer to the pod, Mark's senses went into overdrive. He could hear the orcas' exhalations, see the spray from their blowholes. The male, the one he had come to think of as the leader, was watching their approach with what seemed like keen interest. Remarkable, Dr. Corey muttered, furiously scribbling notes. They're not displaying any aggression. If anything, they seem curious. Mark leaned over the side of the boat, his eyes locked with the male orca. There was something in that gaze, an intelligence that sent shivers down his spine. And then, as if responding to an unspoken signal, the orca began to vocalize. The sound was hauntingly familiar, the same complex series of clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls that Mark had heard during their last encounter. But this time, free from the panic and fear of fighting for his life, he could appreciate the nuance, the almost musical quality of the vocalizations. "It's trying to communicate," Mark said, his voice filled with awe. "Just like before, Doctor." Corey was beside himself with excitement. "This is unprecedented. The similarity to the previous encounter, the focused attention on our boat, it's as if they remember you, Mark." As if to confirm the scientist's words, the male orca swam closer to their boat, rolling slightly to keep its eye above water. Mark found himself leaning further out, drawn by an inexplicable urge to reach out to touch. "Mark, careful," Sarah warned, her hand on his belt, ready to pull him back. But Mark barely heard her. He was lost in the orca's gaze, feeling a connection that defied explanation. In that moment, he wasn't prey or predator, scientist or subject. He was simply another being, reaching across the divide between species. And then, just as it had months ago, the moment passed. The male orca gave one final call, a long, haunting sound that seemed to vibrate through Mark's very bones. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, it dove beneath the waves. The rest of the pod followed, disappearing into the depths as suddenly as they had appeared. For a long moment, no one on the boat spoke. They were all trying to process what they had just witnessed. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. "Okay, I'll say it. What the hell just happened?" Dr. Corey was practically vibrating with excitement. "Gentlemen, I believe we've just witnessed the first confirmed attempt at interspecies communication by orcas. This is revolutionary." But Mark was only half listening. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The connection he had felt with the orca was unlike anything he had ever known. It was as if, for a brief moment, he had glimpsed something beyond human understanding, a form of consciousness that defied explanation. "Mark?" Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" He turned to her, struggling to find the words to describe what he was feeling. I think so. It's just, I felt something out there, Sarah. Something I can't explain." "Doctor?" Corey was suddenly at his side, notepad in hand. "What exactly did you feel, Mark? Can you describe it?" Mark closed his eyes, trying to recapture the sensation. "It was like a presence in my mind, not words exactly, but intentions, emotions. I felt curiosity, intelligence, and something else. Something almost like recognition." The scientist was scribbling furiously. "Fascinating. This could be evidence of some form of telepathic communication. We've long suspected that cetaceans might have capabilities beyond our current understanding." Sarah looked skeptical. "Telepathy? Isn't that a bit far-fetched?" Dr. Corey shook his head emphatically. "Not at all. There's still so much we don't know about cetacean cognition. Their brains are structured differently from ours, with areas that we're only beginning to understand. Who's to say what they're truly capable of?" As the boat made its way back to the cetacean song, Mark found himself lost in thought. The encounter had left him shaken, but not with fear. Instead, he felt a growing sense of wonder and a burning desire to understand. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated itself. The orca pod would appear, seemingly out of nowhere, always keeping their distance from the main research vessel, but approaching the smaller boats. Each time the male would single out Mark, initiating what Dr. Corey had begun to call contact events. These encounters left Mark drained but exhilarated. Each time he felt the strange connection growing, stronger, more defined. He began to have vivid dreams of swimming alongside the orcas, of understanding their world in ways that defied his waking mind. The rest of the research team was making progress as well. The hydrophones had captured hours of orca vocalizations, which Dr. Curry and his graduate students were analyzing day and night. They had identified patterns that seemed to correlate with specific behaviors and were working on a rudimentary dictionary of orca communication. But it was Mark's experiences that continued to baffle and excite the scientists. His ability to seemingly anticipate the orca's appearances, his detailed descriptions of the feelings he received during contact events, it all pointed to something beyond their current scientific understanding. One evening, about 2 months into the expedition, Mark found himself on the deck of the Cetacean Song, staring out at the sunset-painted waves. Sarah joined him, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, echoing her words from that day on the beach that now seemed so long ago. Mark sipped the coffee, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not sure you'd believe them if I told you," he said with a wry smile. Sarah leaned against the railing, her expression serious. "Try me. After everything we've seen out here, I'm pretty sure my belief threshold has been significantly lowered." Mark chuckled but quickly grew serious again. I think they're trying to teach me something, Sarah. Every time we connect, I feel like I'm on the verge of understanding something huge, something that could change everything." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. Mark struggled to find the right words. "It's like they have a different way of seeing the world, not just physically but conceptually. They don't think in words or even images, really. It's more like patterns, vibrations, everything connected in this vast, intricate web." He paused, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that they're trying to show me something important. Something about the ocean, about life itself." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, digesting his words. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Mark, you know I trust you, and I've seen enough out here to know that there's more going on than we understand. But are you sure this isn't affecting you too deeply? You've been through a traumatic experience, and now you're immersed in this intense research. It's natural for your mind to try to make connections, to find meaning." Mark nodded, acknowledging her concern. "I've thought about that. Believe me, I've questioned my own sanity more times than I can count over the past few weeks. But this feels real, Sarah. More real than anything I've ever experienced." He turned to face her fully, his eyes intense. "I think this is why I survived that attack. Why they let me go that night. They were selecting me somehow, preparing me for this." Sarah's expression was a mixture of concern and wonder. "Preparing you for what?" Mark looked back out at the ocean where the last rays of sunlight were painting the waves in shades of gold and pink. "I don't know yet, but I think we're about to find out." As if in response to his words, a familiar fin broke the surface of the water in the distance. The male orca, unmistakable even at this range, had appeared as if summoned by their conversation. Mark felt a now familiar tingle at the base of his skull, a sensation he had come to associate with the orca's presence, but this time it was stronger, more urgent. "They're calling me, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to show me something." Sarah gripped his arm, her voice tight with sudden fear. "Mark, no. Whatever you're thinking, it's too dangerous." But Mark was already moving, stripping off his shirt and kicking off his shoes. "I have to do this. I have to understand." "Mark, stop! Mark!" Sarah's shouts alerted the rest of the crew, but it was too late. Before anyone could stop him, Mark had climbed over the railing and dove into the cool waters of the Pacific. As he surfaced, gasping at the shock of the cold, Mark could hear the commotion on the ship behind him. Shouts of alarm, orders being given, the sound of a rescue boat being prepared. But all of that faded into the background as he fixed his gaze on the approaching orca. The massive creature glided through the water with effortless grace, coming to a stop mere feet from where Mark treaded water. Their eyes met, and in that moment Mark felt the connection snap into place with an almost physical force. Images, sensations, and concepts he had no words for flooded his mind. He saw the ocean as the orcas saw it, a three-dimensional world of sound and vibration, teeming with life and energy. He felt the deep bonds of family and pod, the joy of the hunt, the sorrow of loss, and beneath it all, a growing sense of urgency. The orcas were trying to convey something of vital importance, something about the very nature of the ocean itself. Mark barely noticed as his body began to move, swimming alongside the orca as if guided by an unseen hand. He was dimly aware of the rescue boat following at a distance, of Sarah's voice calling his name, but those things seemed unimportant, trivial compared to the vast flow of information and sensation pouring into his mind. They swam for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Mark was immersed in the orca's world. He felt no fear, no fatigue, only a burning curiosity and a sense of impending revelation. Finally, they came to a stop. Mark found himself in a small cove, surrounded by sheer cliffs. The water here was eerily calm, almost unnaturally so. The rest of the orca pod had joined them, forming a loose circle around Mark and the male. As Mark treaded water, trying to catch his breath and make sense of his surroundings, he felt a gentle nudge against his leg. The male orca had come alongside him, its eye fixed on his face with an almost human intensity. And then, with a clarity that took his breath away, Mark understood. The orcas weren't just trying to communicate. They were trying to warn them, to warn all of humanity. Images flashed through Mark's mind, rising temperatures, changing currents, dying coral reefs. He saw great swaths of the ocean devoid of life, choked by pollution and overfishing. He felt the orcas' growing desperation as their world changed around them, as the delicate balance of the ecosystem tipped further and further out of alignment. But mixed with the warning was something else. Hope. The orcas were reaching out, trying to bridge the gap between their species and humans. They had recognized in Mark, in his survival and his return, a potential ally. Someone who could understand their world and convey its importance to his own kind. As the full weight of this realization settled over him, Mark felt a profound sense of responsibility. He had been chosen not just to survive but to bear witness, to be a voice for the voiceless, a translator between two worlds. The male orca gave one final haunting call, a sound that seemed to resonate in Mark's very bones. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, it dove beneath the waves. The rest of the pod followed, disappearing into the depths as suddenly as they had appeared. Mark found himself alone in the cove, the rescue boat from the cetacean song finally catching up to him. As Sarah and the others helped him aboard, peppering him with questions and concerns, Mark remained silent. How could he possibly explain what he had just experienced? How could he convey the enormity of the task that had been laid before him? As they made their way back to the research vessel, Mark gazed out at the ocean, seeing it with new eyes. The orcas had given him a gift, a perspective that few humans had ever known. But with that gift came a heavy burden. He knew that his life would never be the same. The journey that had begun with terror in the kelp forest had led him here, to a new understanding of his place in the vast interconnected web of life on Earth. And now it was up to him to share that understanding with the world. As the cetacean song came into view, its lights bright against the gathering dusk, Mark made a silent promise, to the orcas, to the ocean, and to himself. He would tell their story, he would make people understand, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change the course of the future. The expedition was over, but Mark Chen's true journey was just beginning.